Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm returning to a topic that I know will make many of you instinctively want to switch off. But bear with me, because although this is about compliance, it's not just for people whose job title includes that word, or words like risk or governance. It's for anyone who's ever been subject to rules they don't fully understand or agree with. Anyone who's ever been told, you have to do this, and when they ask why, the answer is essentially, because regulators expect it, or because that's what the sentencing guidelines say. In other words, it's for anyone who's ever been on the receiving end of, because they said so. My guest is Veronica Root Martinez, a professor of law at Duke University, whose recent work explores a deceptively simple idea, that 100% compliance is impossible. We might like to think and pretend it's achievable, and in some safety-critical domains we of course need it to be. But in most organisations, compliance involves having humans in the loop, and humans are going to make mistakes. Things will get missed, stuff just goes wrong. So if perfect compliance isn't realistic, the real question becomes, how do organisations decide what really matters? Now, the traditional and obvious answer is that you let regulators decide. And in some jurisdictions, particularly in the US, that often means prosecutors. Their priorities, expressed through things like sentencing guidelines and enforcement actions, end up defining what good compliance looks like. But Veronica's argument is that this is the wrong way round. Rather than letting enforcement priorities dictate behaviour, she argues that organisations should set their own compliance priorities based on their purpose, values, and actual risks. It's a way of thinking that's relevant whether you design the rules, enforce them, or simply have to live with them. And it's a far more constructive way of navigating a world where expectations and regulatory priorities are constantly shifting. What Veronica has to say is fascinating, so please enjoy, as I know you will, my discussion with Professor Veronica Root Martinez on purpose-driven compliance. Veronica, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am very, very excited to have you here because before we started recording, we couldn't work out whether it was 2022 or 2023 when we first met, and I came across your fascinating research, and I thought at the time, I really want to get her onto the show, and here you are. So to give people a sense of why I'm so excited about this, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. I'm a professor of law at Duke University School of Law, and I research professional and organizational ethics. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about corporate compliance and ethics and how organizations can build enduring compliance programs and positive organizational cultures. And so that's what a lot of my work is about. And I've been doing this research since 2012. Before I was a professor, I was an associate at a large law firm in Washington, D.C., and I did a lot of regulatory and white-collar work.
And so you're one of these wonderful academics that basically is looking at the realities of the world. So what actually works as opposed to the theory of what works. Your paper that you've recently published is called Purpose-Driven Compliance. Why don't we start by what does that mean?
Sure. So I have been working on a series of compliance papers, but what was kind of gnawing at me the whole time was the reality that modern day compliance infrastructures are built on this foundation that says we can't get to perfect compliance. And that makes sense, right? Because organizations are huge, particularly today. The size of a public firm is much bigger than it was 30 years ago. And so when you think about a person of goodwill in an organization trying to create a compliance program, but they have all of these employees and all of these actors and all of these agents, and sometimes people go rogue. But what was gnawing at me is what happens when you have built a system that specifically tolerates some misconduct. And in behavioral ethics research, which is primarily in kind of business school journals, what that tells you is that when I tolerate just a little bit of misconduct, then that might actually encourage more misconduct. So like the easiest example of this is maybe sexual harassment. So if I tolerate a stray remark, that might then turn into an off-color joke, which may then turn into something else. And even though maybe that stuff isn't legally actionable, particularly in the US, so even though that wouldn't be rising to something that is unlawful, the toleration of misconduct actually can have negative effects on culture. That's kind of the origins of why I started thinking about this. And where I eventually ended up was that maybe some firms have adopted kind of the government's take on things where the government knows it can't stop all misconduct within organizations, but the government's view doesn't have to be the firm's view. So a firm can decide, I am going to try and do more than what I have to do from like an enforcement regime or an enforcement driven perspective, and instead think about what my firm wants to do. So I say that purpose driven compliance is a compliance driven by the company's own purpose. Now that could vary. Like, so, a university has one sort of purpose. Maybe it's like academic freedom and research. And you could have a manufacturing company that's their purpose might be to build the best car possible, right? So the organization's business purpose, the organization's assessment of its business risks, which may or may not be in line with the current enforcement priorities of the day, and the organization's own values, right? So every organization has some sort of stated values. And so what were those firms' values? So that's what I think about purpose-driven compliance. So the organization's purpose, the organization's risks, and the organization's values, and building the compliance program around those three components.
Love this. So much to unpick. So I just want to start with that 100% compliance is impossible. And that it's blindingly obvious to me. I think you're absolutely right. We all make mistakes. I hesitate to say this, but we all break laws, hopefully not major ones, but we will all find ourselves on the wrong side of the rules at some point. And so if a compliance function either is perceived to or sets itself up to be able to deliver 100% compliance, we're going to be disappointed. That's just never, ever going to happen. From a practical perspective, must be correct. But from a sort of theoretical perspective, you do get lots of people that kind of pretend to promise that, who sort of set out as if the target were to drive non-compliance down to zero. So there's an interesting thing. We'd like it to be about 100% compliance, but in reality, as you say, that's not deliverable.
Right. And I should say that it kind of depends on the compliance area. So there are some areas where we do expect 100% perfect compliance. So think about worker safety. And there are a lot of environmental regulations where they do think, no, we want, 100% compliance on this reg. But for most things, that is not necessarily the expectation, right? So if we think about, I think the classic thing that a lot of compliance folks think about is anti-corruption, right? So we would like anti-corruption to be zero. We don't want our employees bribing people. That's generally, I think, the take at most leaders at most firms don't want that to occur. But, if I've got 100,000 employees in a lot of countries all over the world, it could be the case that might sometimes happen. And I don't want to get hit, the firm, don't want to get hit with really big sanctions when I try to put a really good compliance program in place and I had a rogue employee. And that's basically what in the US organizational sentencing guidelines tell us. That's what law and economics literature from the mid-90s tells us. In the US, the state corporate law also says, you just need to have the system in place, you have the right information systems in place. And that all of that rationale, the idea that we don't want to punish an organization because of rogue agents. We want to incentivize the organization to police the conduct of their employees. It basically serves as the foundation, I think, of most compliance programs today, which means the foundation says, a little bit of misconduct, we understand, right? As long as you had enough structure in place. And so, you're right. The practical reality of that is, I think, 100% correct for most compliance areas. But then when we think about, if we back up and think from a more theoretical perspective, but what does it mean when I've tolerated misconduct? What does it mean when I say, but some of it's okay? And I think that can be really, I think that flipping the perspective and saying, what if instead I try to get to perfection? What would that mean from the organization perspective? And when I assess and analyze certain failures differently, one of the things I've noticed as I've been researching in this area is that a lot of the big corporate scandals of the last 15 years were formally detected by the firm, by which I mean someone in the organization realized something was going wrong, but they misunderstood how significant it was going to be. And that misunderstanding led to insufficient investigation of the thing that they detected, which then allowed the problem to get bigger and more problematic. And if they had properly assessed the initial moment of detection as maybe a red flag, as opposed to, oh, it's not a big deal, the outcomes for the organization might be different. And so I think it's important to think through how we conceive of the misconduct that we do find and whether or not this is the sort of thing that is super significant or is not.
In other words, the benchmark for what's a material issue that requires
Mhm.
investigation, discipline, all those sorts of things should be driven very much by, I guess, the risks faced by the firm. So this is what you're pointing to is a sort of risk-based approach to compliance, right? Recognizing there are rules that we'd rather people didn't break, but we'll accept from time to time that if that happens, it's undesirable, but it's going to happen. And then back to your point around safety, there are other things where we absolutely don't ever want that to happen. And I always use Netflix had a lovely parallel about recoverable errors and irrecoverable errors. None of them are desirable, but you make sure that you focus on the irrecoverable stuff that causes real damage. And your point, I guess, is that the prioritization of what that is should be driven by the firm, whisper it, and not by regulators or external bodies, because presumably the logic is each firm is slightly different. Even within the same sector, there'll be differences. But the second thing is the people closest to knowing what those issues are and being able to focus on them and maintain consistency on it are the people within the firm. In other words, we shouldn't be looking to external guys to work out what those irrecoverable things are. We should know that ourselves and focus on that.
Absolutely. So I think that what's been interesting about the development of compliance over the last 20 years is that some of how firms have focused their compliance programs is really motivated by, I'm going to call them third party compliance servicers, right? So that could be a law firm, it could be it could be all sorts of different sorts of actors. But if I'm a Fortune 100 firm and the law firm I use keeps sending out client alerts about how problematic an anti-corruption case could be for the firm. And then I see, these huge multi-million dollar settlements. And then I start thinking, do we have anti-corruption risk? Now, there is something beneficial about the education that organizations get from these third-party consultants. There's absolutely a benefit there. But that isn't necessarily where a firm should start in today's compliance environment. I think the reality is that the work of federal enforcement authorities, the organizational sentencing guidelines, the focus on corporate enforcement activity after the Holder memo in 1999, what that did was it created these really strong incentives for firms to create sophistication in their compliance programs. And I think that most large, complex organizations do have pretty sophisticated compliance programs at this point. And then the question is, okay, so now that we have that floor, how do we pivot and really think about, okay, is the government's priority right now the thing that really is my biggest risk? So last year, when the Trump administration put out the executive order pausing FCPA enforcement, you would kind of see people saying, well, does the FCPA still matter? Or what does this mean? What does this mean for compliance? And if you are focused primarily on enforcement authorities, then that response makes sense, right? Like, they said they're not going to enforce it for a little while. What does that mean? Should I still be investing in this? But if you are focused on the firm's purpose and the firm's risks, right? So some firms have quite a lot of anti-corruption exposure. And that anti-corruption exposure doesn't go away because the Trump administration pauses enforcement. One, there's a statute of limitations that is beyond the Trump administration. But two, there are organizations worldwide now who are focused on that. So the pause on anti-corruption enforcement, that's an external factor that I'm not saying isn't important. But if I'm really focused on my business purpose and business risk, if anti-corruption is one of my top 10 risks, I should still be focused on that, regardless of what the US government is doing at this particular snapshot in time. And the other thing I think that would be really helpful and beneficial about adopting a purpose-driven compliance program is it allows the program to be more resilient. So even as you see these enforcement swings, then there are enforcement swings as administrations change. My own view is it's pretty cyclical. But, it's expensive to put in internal control, right? But if I've made the internal control decisions based off of my business purpose and my business risk and my business values, then even as the enforcement swings are happening, I shouldn't have to swing too hard because I've already focused and targeted my program on what I think my true risks are. And so regardless of what's happening from an enforcement perspective, if I have tailored my program in a way that makes sense for my business, then it should be more enduring. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I love it from just from a logistical perspective, right? If you're having to sort of shift particularly if you can't necessarily control the agenda. I mean, you can try and control it by lobbying and those kinds of things, but bottom line is there will be certain things that are out with your control. And so you're going to be at the mercy of forces that you're not necessarily always able to influence. So that's challenging and it's expensive and ramping up and ramping down and shifting. But the second is from a behavioral perspective. If we think about compliance as being, we need to get the people within the organization to do the things we need them to do, not do the things that we don't. That consistency becomes really important because otherwise it's sort of like, well, if we hang around long enough, that problem's going to go away. It becomes much harder for people to navigate rules that are flexing. So I can see it both just from, even if you just looked at it as a sort of systems problem, what you're saying, I think makes sense because then you can invest in this properly. It will be for the long term because it's matched to your priorities and risks. And the second thing is it gives you a much cleaner behavioral narrative.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think for folks within the organization, it does, so there's some other kind of strands of literature that are outside my kind of law school realm. Employees are going to be more invested in the work of the compliance efforts if they understand them to be procedurally just and procedurally fair. So Tom Tyler has a lot of work on these concepts. So if I, as an organization, have said, this is our business purpose, these are our risks, this is what we need to account for, and then I stay true to that, and then I run my program and, guide my employees and sometimes maybe sanction employees within the things that I've set out, then the employees are going to believe that I'm walking the walk and I'm walking and talking the talk. But if I just keep changing the rules all the time, then the employees are they're gonna forget that this is important. You're not going to be able to kind of reinforce the messaging. They're not going to think you're serious, and they're not going to be invested in the program. The other thing I think that is important from a purpose-driven compliance perspective is the reality is that enforcement authorities are always chasing their tail. So there are always going to be new, innovative things that companies come up with, and that is good. Innovation is good. Risk is good, right? So you're not going to be. It is unlikely that you're going to be a super successful company if you don't have employees who are willing to take some sort of risks, right? So risk is a good thing, but the question is, let's say you think of it, you have this new product or this new idea that the regulators haven't figured out what they want to do with yet, but you still have to figure out what the guardrails are going to be for your organization, right? So, because at some point the regulator is going to wake up, right? And so as business innovators are putting out these new ideas, there have to be some sort of guardrails in place so that employees and stakeholders within the firm understand how to make good decisions, right? And so part of why a purpose-driven compliance is important is it might actually help embolden your employees to know these are my guardrails. And that's part of why the firm's values still matter, that these are the guardrails that this organization has put in place for me to make decisions. I might not have a formal regulatory environment that will tell me exactly what I can and cannot do, but my firm has given me some guardrails, and I'm going to do my best to make the best decisions possible within those guardrails, given what this organization stands for and what the expectations are. And I just think it's really important because the enforcement-driven programs are always going to be chasing their tail, and a regulator, we can't pass regulation for things that we don't know are going to happen yet, right? And so there is a limiting factor there. If a program is really being driven by what enforcement authorities are going to do, you're never being proactive, and I don't think the program is going to be as resilient as it could be.
And I think this is, the most obvious place for this is tech, right? If we looked at cryptocurrencies, if we looked at social media, if we look at AI, and so on and so forth, it's kind of obvious that regulators won't create regulations around that, either if something they've never seen or something that they don't fully understand, or whisper it. Sometimes they want to wait and see what the risks are so they can write more intelligent. You don't want to write dumb rules. And so I think this is a really interesting thing. And so you're kind of going, in order to get the R&D and the innovation, what we need to do is we need to allow people to do things. How do we give them the guides to do that? Well, we tie it back to what we're all about. And then there's a consistency. And I like that because I think that one gives clarity to people. But I think two is much more defensible because you say we have stuck to our principles. And I guess in a situation where your principles turned out to be massively detrimental to society, you're in a much stronger position if you've been consistent across this piece than if you've kind of decided to cut a bit fast and loose here and not have that level. So it seems to me that it meets both a practical test, but also a kind of consistency test that would give you a better. So if you were worried about what happens when we get into trouble, it's a much more defensible narrative to say this is how we always approach this stuff and this sits within what we do, than it is to kind of go, well, we didn't really pay much attention to that.
Absolutely. And I do think that we are, I think, all of us in a moment of pivot when we're trying to think about, we have these new emerging technologies. How can we use and adopt them in an ethical way, right? So in the university perspective, we're thinking about it like, what does this mean for teaching? What does this mean for research? What does this mean for this, that, and the other? And the technology is not going to go away. And so we have to figure out, right?
You can wish it away.
Right. The tech is here and the tech could be really helpful, right? And so how can we learn how to use this in a way that is ethical and that adheres to our principles, right? And so if I know that as a member of the legal academy, like part of what I'm supposed to adhere to is honesty in research, is not making things up, is not hallucinating, is trying to tie my work to things that are real laws, real examples, then I know that I can't just like plop things into some sort of generative AI and be like, just give me something, right? Like I have to make sure it actually works. And so, within the legal space, I feel like every day I open my email, there's another example of somebody with hallucinated cases. And so when we think about like part of my job, if I'm a practicing attorney, part of my job is to educate the court. Like that's part of what the job of an attorney is when they're practicing before court. I'm educating the court because the judges are generalists for the most part. They don't have every case memorized, right? So part of my job is to advocate for my client, but also educate the court. If I'm educating the court with hallucinated cases, I've actually done something. I've not done my job properly, right? And so part of what we have to train, like for example, new baby lawyers today is how do I use this technology in a way that's responsible, that doesn't abdicate my responsibility for my business purpose, part of which is to educate the court while I'm advocating for my clients. And the same is going to be true for large organizations. And so you need guardrails in place so that when you come up with the great idea, you think, how would this work? So if we think about the 2008 financial crisis, somebody came up with this innovative product called a mortgage-backed security. And that person, I don't think was thinking, let me crash the financial system, right? I think they thought, I found something cool. I figured something out. I figured out a new thing that we can create that might create monetary value for the firm. And there are a lot of things that create monetary value for firms. Obviously, we can't do everything. We cannot pursue legally or ethically everything that might create monetary value for firms. And so it is, I think, the organization's responsibility to explain to the employees, we want you to be innovative. We want you to take risk. We want you to come up with new ideas. And we also want to be positive members of society and to think about and not harm society in the process. The idea of civil society, I think, is more developed in the EU. And anyway, it is more developed in some jurisdictions than others. So I don't think US firms talk about civil society quite as much and in the same way. But the reality is that organizations are really important to everyday lives. And when something goes wrong at an organization, it affects not just the folks who maybe were foreclosed upon, but it affects the folks that work at the organization. It affects how they feel about their day, about the value and dignity of their work. And that can be true of the CEO down to the janitor, right? And so when we think about creating positive organizational cultures, it matters for so many reasons, but putting these guardrails in place can help us as we go forward. And if we mess up, because we mess up, as you said at the beginning, so none of us are perfect and we do sometimes mess up, we can say, look, we made these decisions using the following steps. We did our best. Turns out it didn't work this time, but it was a miss. And then you can hopefully remediate and move on.
And in a way, I guess if I were to sort of think about it as a sort of analogy, I guess what you're pointing towards is to say that we can't have a map for everything, but we can provide people with a compass. And that might
absolutely.
That might be a moral compass, it might be legal, but it's a sense of this is how we, in uncharted territories where there is no clarity, and maybe it's a lack, and what I think is interesting about yours is maybe there's a lack of clarity because there is no regulation. Or maybe it's a lack of clarity because Whisperer, I was once taught some stuff, but the training was way too complicated, or they didn't talk about this specific case, or they haven't contemplated this particular thing. So it may be a combination of employee failure to understand or be aware of something, which may be their fault, maybe the compliance function's fault, or there may be no overarching thing. You've given people a way of navigating that piece. And I think this works well for areas where the rules aren't obvious to people, or we're just in the heat of the moment, where it's kind of like I'm doing things and I know we're all supposed to go and think, am I allowed to do this shit? All those kind of processes. But in the heat of the moment, and you can see it in fast moving environments like financial services, where people, if they were able to think clearly and sit back in a cool state of mind, they might come to a different conclusion. But in the heat of the moment, you're kind of giving people, I guess, a sort of a set of heuristics, I suppose, for how to navigate this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, so in the behavioral ethics research, so Anne Ten Brunzell writes about this. She's a professor at Notre Dame. You can think about, I can ask a question from a variety of different perspectives. And so I can ask a question in a way that makes people think about legal risk, and I might get one answer. I can ask a question that motivates like a business kind of perspective, and I'll get a different answer. And I could ask a question that motivates an ethical frame, and I might get yet a different answer. So how we ask questions, whether it's from a legal, business, or ethical frame, really can dictate the response. And so if you have created a compliance program that is driven by enforcement regimes, what you're really motivating is a kind of legal frame to answering this question. But if you think about it like, this is my business, this is the thing that we are striving to make as good as possible from a purpose perspective, and also from that firm's values perspective, then I am attempting to motivate some of the ethical frame. Or maybe even, I guess it's the way that I've set it up, you would think about legal, business, and ethical framing. And it's important not to lose the ethical framing, in part because the legal framing will never be complete, right? Which is what I was saying earlier. The other thing I just mention is that the article says that the purpose-driven compliance should be motivated in part on the firm's values. And I say firm's values very purposefully, because anytime you start talking about ethics, particularly within an organization, people say, well, what I think is ethical might not be the same thing as what Sally thinks is ethical and what Joe thinks is ethical. And so how are we supposed to make any decisions based off of ethics? And fair point, I take it, particularly when we're thinking about multinational organizations where you might have employees operating in vastly different cultural environments with different sorts of expectations. But the firm itself can come up with values and expectations that it wants its employees to adhere to. And if those expectations don't align with the individual employee's values, then the employee can exit, right? And so that's why I centered it on the firm's values, which means it's important for the firm to have some stated values. A few years ago, I did a project where I was reviewing a bunch of compliance program documents. And the thing that was interesting was that the documents would almost always start with some sort of ethical phrase, like, we are a firm that really values integrity. Integrity is a big one. We value integrity and respect for all something. And then as soon as you went down through the document, it looked like a junior associate had written the rest of the document with like a little checklist next to them that's like, okay, this is the regulatory risk, this is the regulatory risk, right? And I understand that. I understand how those documents were created. I understand why those documents were created, but you really didn't have anything meaningful in the document, almost all of the documents that I reviewed that were attempting to motivate the ethical framing and the ethical decision-making. And that does a disservice to employees. One of the risks we have right now, particularly with the new emerging technologies, is that we might make employees think that their judgment and their responsibility over decisions doesn't matter anymore, right? So like if I can really automate sort of like third-party supplier risk, like if I can put a bunch of, tech internal controls in place so it's harder to bribe people, then maybe the humans on the other side are going to think, oh, I don't really need to pay attention because the tech is going to figure it out. And we don't want to be in a space where we've created maybe positive systems that have then eroded the employee's understanding that their individual autonomy still matters and that their individual decision-making still matters, because they're still going to be able to, they might still be the most valuable tool you have to detect when something's going amiss. Also, they also might be your most valuable tool at telling you when innovation is important. So, what the psychological safety literature tells us is that if I feel comfortable speaking, if I'm in a psychologically safe environment, I'm going to feel comfortable speaking out both when there's a problem and when I have a good idea. And so, if you've told your employees that they don't matter and that they should just focus on what the tech told them, you might miss a lot of good ideas, right? Like, because you want them speaking not just when there's a problem, but also when they have a good idea. And so it's just really important that you've set up a system that encourages the employees to participate. Otherwise, you could miss both problems and opportunities.
I love that. I never thought about that positive framing on a psychological safety, but I absolutely love that. But I was thinking, it's interesting because actually, if we think about technology to solve these problems, we have to code the tech somehow. And by default, we know that often we come across situations where the reason we need a new playbook or rule book is because the old rule book didn't work for these particular things. Hence, we have new regulations covering new things. And so if we look at tech that reverts to the mean and looks at past experience as the relevant data set, that's just going to replicate the problem that we've got in the thing anyway. And then I thought about situations where when the tech fails for whatever reason. And back to my sort of visual brain thinking, well, this is a little bit like people's overdependence on GPS units, right? They don't know how to navigate. They blindly follow what the tech does. They drive into rivers, or they don't know what to do when, for some reason, they're out of coverage or out of range. And so I love this idea of how do we build something sustainable when we need that human in the loop. And so I think this is it's a really, really nice uplifting point as well, because I think a lot of the sort of theory, as you say, is, and there's lots of vendors out who have motivated reasoning for making this happen, but technology will solve all these problems. We can get rid of these awkward humans that don't get things right. And I love that idea because what you're pointing towards here is a very healthy combination of human and machine. Let's get the strengths of both, and we need both of them in the system.
Absolutely. I mean, so we should use every tool at our disposal, and at least I am still figuring out how to use the new technology tools well. My organization, I guess they upgraded our ability to use something, and the tech actually gave me a graphic last week that I could use in a PowerPoint without any weird hallucinated characters. And I got really confused. I was like, wait, it never makes me good graphics. What happened? And it turned out we'd gotten an upgrade overnight. And so, and it was great. I was like, man, that's a really wonderful image to add to my PowerPoint. I wasn't expecting it to work, but it actually worked today. The tech is great. Like it would have taken me 30 minutes to make the same image, right? So we can use the tech in ways that can be really powerful. But then also sometimes the tech, I'll have read something and then the tech will tell me the thing says something else. I'm like, but that's not what this said, or it completely misses what the most meaningful thing is in the report, right? That I might be reading. And so keeping the human judgment is super important to ensure that the compliance program is working. But you're absolutely right. If I'm going to code a compliance program based off of tech, I'm probably going to start with our regulations, right? Like I'm probably going to start with the legal frameworks, right? Because I don't know. I mean, I don't know how else I would, right? And so I'm sure there are people smarter than me that are going to tell me there's some other way to do it. But I feel like that's where most people would start with is, well, we have anti-money laundering laws. We're not allowed to do certain activities. They're not allowed to be above certain thresholds, or they're not allowed to be from certain countries, right? Like, so that might be the starting point. But you want also to have allowed your employees a framework to make decisions so that when they see the generated reports, they say, why didn't the report find X? And I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes the tech malfunctions. I was on a rather large investigation when I was in practice. And I'd actually been in London for about 10 weeks working on this case. And the day before I was supposed to leave, 4 million documents disappeared from my database. And a human had to figure that out. I was like, where'd the document go? And so then we call the vendor and I'm like, I'm really concerned, blah, blah, blah. And then, 15 minutes later, they're like, yeah, they're gone. And I'm like, okay, right. But if like you needed a human to say, this shouldn't be, I've been working with this long enough to know that this shouldn't be what I'm seeing. Something has gone wrong. But I don't know how you would have detected it, but for a human having been watching the thing over time. You know what I mean? Right? Like, so it is important for there to be experienced individuals watching things over time within an organizational structure.
And it also strikes me that your rationale helps remove a major problem, which is human ingenuity. So often organizations that have ridiculously large rule books feel safer, right? We'll write loads and loads of rules. But the more detailed the rule book is, we know, the more loopholes you actually produce. Because if it's detailed and you didn't put something in there, that suggests that you didn't mean to put it in there because you've got tons of rules there. And so I'm thinking back to sort of disciplinary processes I've been involved in. I not the one being disciplined, but on the other side of the fence. And typically it was always people finding, well, it didn't say in the rule book that I couldn't do that. And what your purpose-driven compliance seems to me points towards is to go, yeah, there will be detailed rules that we might want to focus on. But actually, we can just turn around and say, you made that decision. How does that fit with our purpose? How does it fit in with the principles? It removes an opportunity for sort of either lazy compliance or even malicious compliance, where people find these loopholes and things. And so I love it. You sort of tie it back to a conversation that we can all have. You don't need to be an expert in the rules to navigate this stuff. And it seems to me to be really powerful as a tool on the ground, but also really powerful if you wanted to monitor what people are doing, to discipline them. It seems a much better basis to do that.
I think that that's right. So one of the classes I teach here at Duke is ethics and management to daytime MBA students. And one of the organizations we looked at this past semester was Costco. And if you look at Costco's mission statement and code of ethics, Costco's code of ethics is 4 lines. Line 1, obey the law. Line 2, take care of our members. Line 3, take care of our employees. Line 4, respect our suppliers. Now, I don't have Costco's internal documents, so I don't know what I could find if I was on their internal website. But I do know that I looked a really long time to try and find additional things. It's like, it's only 4 lines. Like, really, like, that can't work, right? And so, but there's something really beautiful about a 4-line code of ethics, right? So first, don't break the law. That's got to be the foundation of all compliance programs, right? So I think that the work that has been done on by enforcement authorities is super valuable and necessary. It's just that they're not sufficient, right? Like, so it has to be in place. You are going to have organizations that are rogue actors. You are going to have organizations that make decisions to break the law. We saw that with Volkswagen and Dieselgate. Like, that was a decision not to comply with regulatory requirements. My framework doesn't really work there, right? Like, where someone's made had said, I'm going to break the law. But I think for most organizations that are being run, I think, by people of goodwill who want to do good things, who want the organization to make money, but also don't want to harm society, right? Not overly complicating things is actually probably pretty valuable. And I think the Costco 4 things, any employee can understand this. I need to not break the law. I need to make sure that my customers are taken care of. I need to take care of my employees or my fellow employees. That is something that basically anyone of any educational level can understand. And then you can be more targeted, right? Like, so if you've got folks within the firm who spend all their day buying things from third-party suppliers, you might, I assume that they have additional training because that's really risky for a lot of organizations is third-party supply chain, right? So I'm sure that they have trainings and stuff that deal with that, but not every member of the organization needs that, right? But every member of Costco's organization probably needs their 4 bullet points, and laying it out simply and concretely, that empowers an employee to think, is my decision right now, is it taking care of a member, or what is it doing? And if I'm not taking care of one of the Costco members, which is their customers, then how can I better make decisions so that I am taking care of the member, right? And can I do that in a framework that is also compliant with the law and compliant with what Costco needs to do? So I do think sometimes simpler is better, although I respect that for highly regulated industries that can be challenging. We also went through some of the Novartis compliance documents, which are much longer than Costco's 4 bullet points.
But it's an interesting principle to start with the simple stuff, right? And build from that. And I love what you're doing in identifying the sort of simple, at least the idea of having some simple principles that we can then drill down into where necessary. You've got something, one, that's user-friendly, but I think, 2, of course, there are going to be tensions between these things. The categories you've outlined there, you might be able to look after one of the Costco members really well by breaking the law.
Right.
Right. So we know that in extremis, there will be tensions between all of these things. So it's not a case of these things are always going to beautifully sit next to each other. But what you're doing is giving people a tool to think through the problem and a lens to approach it through. And so I like that as a simple sort of guide. And then you can start actually, if you think organizationally in those terms, you can start to say, well, actually, if we think about day-to-day situations, where is this going to be most acute? Where are these? And then because we're building a program for a longer period of time, we're not sort of making tactical fixes around this. We can actually start to say, where are the pinch points in the organization? Where might a dynamic see value 1 and value 3 clashing? And what do we do at that point? And we guide people through that. And we can spend our time looking at the complexities of it. And so I actually, as I was reading your paper and sort of thinking about this, it seemed to me that when we have simplicity as a start point, we don't stop there in terms of our thinking of the compliance program. That's just the sort of headlines, but we can then start to recognize the detail. And then we can, well, where in the detail do we need to focus? As opposed to the classic approach, which is we dump everything on everyone. Everybody must do this training because they're an employee. Well, does that actually help them?
Exactly. And sometimes we have regulatory failures, right? Sometimes companies put in place trainings because of some sort of resolution with the government. And the resolution, I once had a gentleman who was serving as a compliance consultant for a corporate integrity agreement for U.S. Health and Human Services, which is basically a monitor. And the resolution itself, I was chatting with the gentleman, and he said, the resolution itself said I had to train all employees. And then I had to go in person. I had to do training of all employees in person. And so then he had to go back to the government because he didn't come into play until after this had already been resolved. It was already in the corporate integrity agreement. He's just trying to do what is in the corporate integrity agreement. And then he realizes what's in there doesn't make any sense. And so then he has to go back to the company and the government and say, this is what the agreement says. I can do this, but do you really want me to do this? Like, do you really want me to do in-person training for every employee on this risk? Or do you want me to do training of these sorts of employees who might run into this risk? And I think that, they ended up changing the requirements of the agreement. But sometimes the regulator themselves, they don't appreciate, something goes into an agreement and they don't appreciate what it's actually going to mean for someone to do the thing that they've put in the agreement. And it is often the case that the folks negotiating these agreements are not the ones who are going to be executing the requirements, down the chain, right? And so the other reason I think a purpose-driven compliance program can be beneficial is if I can show that I have a really strong compliance program, my resolution agreements should be less onerous, and you have less likelihood that some of these, I'm going to call them regulatory failures or enforcement authority failures is probably the better way to put it, aren't going to end up put on to my organization. And I think that that's really important. Now, one of the, I think, critiques someone might have for my purpose-driven compliance framework is I focus some on culture and the importance of creating strong, positive organizational cultures. And one response is, how do I measure culture if I'm in a negotiation with the Department of Justice, right? I can tell them how many trainings I did. I can show, there's things that I can quantify really easily. And those quantifiable things are what I tended to see when I was doing my review of compliance program documents a few years ago. I was like, I can see how they could then put this in a chart and then see government, I tried to have this really effective ethics and compliance program and see all these things. I think it's going to get harder for firms to do that sort of negotiation in the current environment, in part because there's been this move, both from scholars and from the government itself, to move away from counting what I'm going to call inputs and more focused on, well, what were your outputs? And so I think basically all organizations are going to have to spend some time thinking about, how am I engaging in an assessment on the effectiveness of my compliance program? And some of that has to be an assessment of culture. And there are ways to think about what your culture looks like. So there are ways to do surveys or interviews to figure out, do my employees feel psychologically safe? Do they feel like if they were to report in my Speak Up program, would it be responded to? I mean, you can stress test things like that. Like you can get someone to stress test your Speak Up program, put some fake complaints in, see how they were done. How much time did it take? I mean, so there are things that an organization can do today that maybe they couldn't have done 20 years ago while we were building this sophistication and capacity to have these compliance programs at complex organizations. And I think that just probably wasn't there at time A, but now we're at time B, and these, I'm going to call them squishier things, are now going to be more of an expectation. But that is good because in theory, that means that a company should be able to fine tune its compliance program and have better results, right? Because this is going to be an iterative process. It's unlikely that you're going to be able to have a static compliance program over the long term.
And I'm smiling because the way I got into the work that I do is exactly what you talked about. So I was the regulator that imposed stuff on the firm that I ended up working for. And then eating my own regulatory cooking, I was like, man, this is not what was intended. Right? And it's how does one, and it's a sort of, well, if we make everybody do the training, well, that's job done, right? That's secure and safe. But actually, that comes with a whole load, not just the cost of doing it, is actually those people that don't need to have the training start to go, well, this compliance stuff is irrelevant, doesn't speak to me. I'm not going to pay any attention to it, right? I only have so much cognitive bandwidth. I'm going to ignore this stuff. And so I think what I love about the research and the way you talk about it is, one, you're providing a path for people to explore. Two, I think you're making it much less likely that you get these performative solutions. Because if I looked at a failure in an organization that's adopted your approach, and imagine it had got to a level where there's some serious remediation required, that's unlikely to be a fault at the sort of purpose level. It's going to be a flaw lower down in the kind of operational thing. And therefore, you're not kind of throwing out the entire program and going, we need to start again. It's like, here's a bit of it that didn't work out, but that doesn't lead into question the entire structure.
Absolutely.
So I think you probably get better solutions. And I think the third thing is you're allowing the dialogue to happen that says to, the likes of me when I was a regulator, is to go, look, actually, I know you might think that this is a way to solve the problem, right? More training, more this, more that, more controls. Let's have 8 eyes checks rather than 4 eyes checks. But it doesn't work. And let's have a discussion about that. And I think we have to we have to stop people getting into trouble if we can, but that's going to happen to some level. But we have to get to the source of some of this problem, which is the regulatory issue. And so I love the fact that through your thinking, even if there are, situations in which it wouldn't, it's imperfect, right? Which plays into you can't get 100% compliance. We're not having this delusional discussion that it's feasible, but I think you're helping open that debate. And I think that's the really important bit. So I would say, I think this is powerful stuff because at least it opens up another angle on these things that we think are solutions, they might actually make things worse.
And really, that was what was motivating the initial idea of the project, right? So I think when I joined the Legal Academy, I don't think there were many legal scholars who identified as I study compliance, because really compliance is interdisciplinary in the sense that, like, some people have a corporate law background, some people have a criminal law background, some people have a law and economics background. What makes me distinct as a scholar is I try and bring in these ethical framework kind of ideas as I'm thinking about compliance. But now we have a lot of folks in the Legal Academy who will say, yeah, I study compliance. And that's exciting and it's rigorous. But then that means that we're at a time where we have to, I think it would be beneficial for us to think about what are the things we took for granted, right? Like when this field was beginning, what were the things that we accepted as truth and then we built all of our work upon? And do those things that we thought in the beginning still make sense today? Now that there's been more capacity, more enforcement authority. I mean, when we think about the enforcement realities of today, they're vastly different than they were in 2000. The ability of multi-jurisdictional enforcement, the amount of intercountry cooperation, even just the settlement. I mean, like, it's very different now than it was before. One, because of cooperation, but two, because of technology, right? Because it's become easier for folks to share information across jurisdictional authorities. The capacity of the OECD has helped to encourage certain types of collaboration and cooperation. And so part of the origins of this project, particularly the part where I started talking about what does it mean to tolerate a certain level of misconduct, is really about what if we were just to sit back and think, what if we reimagined the world, given what we know today that we didn't know in 1999, right? And I think that there are probably other questions, I don't know exactly what they are today, that are also ripe for thinking about. But that was a big motivation for the project is we've spent all this time doing this now. Like, maybe it's time to take a step back and think about, okay, are there ways in which we could do it better? And so anyway, so I think enforcement-driven compliance was necessary. It absolutely was necessary for us to build capacity. Now that the capacity is built, for the most part, what is the next step? Right. And maybe taking a step back and thinking about what is my organization's purpose is the right way to go.
And I love the idea of, in the same way that businesses can't keep doing what they've always done, right? You have to evolve. Well, as new technology arrives, as social trends change, as other factors come into play, it would almost, it makes perfect sense to sort of sit there and go, actually, if regulators want the regulatees to have sustainable businesses, they see that they need to adapt. Well, the same thing ought to be true for regulators, right? Is you can't sort of operate on a prehistoric model. And I agree. I think a lots of the tools that were used were, I'm not even sure they were necessarily the best available. They were just the easiest things to grab and the easiest to justify in many cases. But nonetheless, there's now a body of work that says how, how did that work out for us, right? And we should view this as an experiment. And I think this is where I love having these sorts of conversations, because I think it's almost like there is often an approach that says we've cracked this. And we can't have cracked it, right? One, because human beings adapt. Two, because the environment changes. And three, because we're unlikely to have stumbled on the right answer first time round. So we should be taking all these things. So I love that positive way of looking at it. And I think recognizing that if we don't do that, we're going to be stuck. And we can see this with social trends, we have to move with the times and to take the knowledge that we now have and adapt. So I love this. And so I think what's great about what you're doing is it's a provocation to think differently and permission to talk about it and to kind of go, maybe we got that wrong.
Absolutely. And I love the word experimentation, because let's say I experimented with a new training model, right? And instead of just counting my inputs, I start counting my outputs. And I find out, you know what? That did not work. That was not sticky enough. It turns out 3 months, 6 months later, they don't remember what they were supposed to do, or they misunderstood it. That's good, right? So having something not work isn't necessarily a problem. It is information that allows you to then tweak things going forward. But if you're only counting inputs and not doing assessments of outputs, you might spend another 3 years giving training to folks that really isn't helpful. And it is just not a good investment of resources for anyone, right? And so when we think about experimenting in the compliance space, it is, you might even think, I'm going to articulate my firm's values in this way. Guess what? Maybe the American conceptualization of that value did not translate well to certain environments within my organizational structure. And so I might have to think about, no, this is still a core value, but how do I express this value in a way so that my employees and my stakeholders get the point, right? And so I think, and part of that is about doing climate surveys, about doing assessments, about going and actually talking to people. But then you end up with a better program. And sometimes you have to change things. But that is not a bad thing. And I really hope that firms don't get penalized if they're like, yeah, we tried that and it didn't work, right? Like, if anything, I think that means that they should get credit. Like the fact that they identified a part of their program that didn't work, that means that their program is working because they
Right.
right. Like, so, right. Like that means it worked. Like if I've identified where something didn't work as I had hoped, I have done my job properly. And now I just keep trying. Right. And sometimes it takes 3-4 times to figure out what the best intervention is going to be for my workforce.
But I mean, it's really interesting when you're talking this terms, because I always compare it to marketing, right? If you said, I'd like $1 million to spend on an ad campaign, and somebody said, well, how do you know it's going to work? And you said, well, I have no idea, but we did it last. That's what we did last year, right? That's what everybody else is doing. You'd get fired. You probably wouldn't get the budget, but you get fired at some point for being negligent. And if an ad campaign doesn't work, you pull it. Whereas the compliance thing seems to be a sort of like, well, we'll just do what everybody else is doing, what we keep doing, without recognizing that it's an experiment. And to your point, some of these things you can make things worse, right? You can actually encourage non-compliance by, I don't know, boring training or controls that suggest lack, whatever it is, or incentive programs that aren't smart. You can make things worse. And I think there's a natural presumption that any intervention must be a good intervention. And if it's the intervention we've always used, and some of this is, of course, the narrative of keeping regulators happy, and it's what they expect to see. And I hate the phrase best practice that someone somewhere has decided says who and why, all those questions. But I think this is really powerful. I love this because it's just, we all know this instinctively, right? That things aren't going to work out the way we plan them to do. And that's how we get better.
And the focus on best practice, though, that comes from the enforcement-driven compliance regime, right? So if you go read the organizational sentencing guidelines, they say that one of the points they're going to do an assessment on is whether or not you met industry practice. Like, so if you control F for the words industry practice, it's right in there. So when I define compliance, in my work, I usually define it as compliance with legal and regulatory norms, industry practice, and the firm's internal policies and procedures. And the reason I define it in that way is because that a failure on any of those three things can result in legal liability, essentially, right? Like even if you haven't broken the law, if you violated your internal policies, there are enforcement actions where that has been the impetus, is that you didn't follow your internal policies. But that's an enforcement-driven model of compliance, right? And that was necessary. And it's not that industry practice doesn't matter, at all, right? Like that could be informative. But what if you're absolutely right. What if the whole industry picked something bad, right? And then we're all just doing this bad thing and perpetuating this bad intervention that's not helpful. And there is some scholarship, particularly in the employment discrimination space, where it turns out that a lot of firms did do that, where they adopted things because it was industry practice. And if they got sued and they walked into court and they were like, well, I did what everybody else in the industry did, then that essentially functioned as a quasi-affirmative defense, and then they wouldn't be liable, right? So there are things in our system that create poor incentives. But if I'm focused on my business and I'm focused on my purpose and I'm focused on my people and how do I communicate with them in a way where they know they still have autonomy, they still have responsibility, that they are valued, and that this business has a purpose that is also valuable, not just because it makes money, but because we're doing this thing, then I think we end up with some better outcomes. So, the framing of the compliance program that the government has does not need to be the framing that a company builds for itself. The company can build in the government screening when it does its risk assessment, but that would just be one part of the risk assessment. And thinking in a really fulsome way about a firm's risk assessment is just incredibly important, not just for legal risk, but for reputational risk, for stakeholder risk, for business risk generally. And so if we can figure out ways to get companies to think about risk in a more expansive way, I think it would be really beneficial both to the firm and their stakeholders and potentially to society.
I love this. You are absolutely preaching to the converted here, because I think, it is that, and it is largely a conversation I have with people in the US, which is always that question of, well, what do prosecutors think? And from a European perspective, I always sort of go, why am I worrying about what happens when it goes wrong? I want to stop it going wrong in the first place. And I totally understand the logic that gets you there. But it's a very extrinsically motivated model. It's not looking at what we're here to do. And I think leads to, and I hate the word compliance, right? If you were trying to pick something that sounded awful, you would pick a word like that and then add the suffix officer just to make it sound even worse. But if we've already got this terrible thing, we don't want to kind of be saying, yeah, we've got to do this because they said so. And you point to the big bad wolf that's just outside there that might come and, blow the house down or whatever. I think it's much more compelling, and it makes the compliance function feel much more embedded in the business if the language that's used and the rationale that's used is the business rationale, not some rationale with the thing that's outside the door that's going to come and cause us problems. Because then we're not masters and mistresses of our own destiny then.
Absolutely. And we don't get to be told what to do, right? Like that's not a good, I'm a parent, you tell your kid to do something, why? I told you so is never a sufficient answer for why, like, you need to do whatever.
It's the excuse of last resort, I think. It's like, I have nothing there. I have nothing left.
Right. It's like, why do I have to put on this hat? Well, because I want you to be warm so you don't get cold, right? You have to, and no CEO who's come up with this really wonderful idea or who has this broad vision of his company and is thinking about all the things that they're going to accomplish wants to say here, well, you can't do it because the regulator said you can't, right? And so this doesn't sound great. And so to the extent that we can pivot and think, yeah, also there's a regulation that says maybe you shouldn't do this, but also like, let's think about how we can make our decisions in a way that builds on the vision that we have for the firm and that also enables us to comply. I agree with you. Compliance, man, people's eyes glaze over when I say I research compliance. And also comply, but to really thrive, because at the end of the day, that's what businesses want to do, right? Like they want to meet whatever their stated goals and objectives are in a way that allows them and their stakeholders to thrive and to be enduring. And so figuring out the best way to create systems and internal controls that are going to allow and facilitate that is just really important.
Love this. Beautifully put. Veronica, I could keep talking to you, as I've demonstrated previously, but time is always as ever against us, and I'm conscious that you've dedicated enough of yours to the show. The research is, I don't know if it's out yet or coming out, but is definitively worth a read. Where are you at the moment? What's happening at the moment? What's the next area of interest? I mean, I sense this is a mission, right? This is not just a one and done. You are on a mission to change things, and more power to you for that. But what's coming up next on the agenda?
So right now, Kevin Davis and I at NYU, we've just finished up a project where we've interviewed folks in the compliance sector to determine what the barriers or incentives are for inter-firm collaboration in the compliance industry. And so that paper is done. I could send it to folks. It'll be on the web probably in the next few weeks. And then another co-author and I, Jiyoung Min, we've been working on a paper on emerging technologies and compliance and how to think about implementing these emerging tech within the compliance program. That paper also is done and will be on the web in the next 2 weeks. So that's what's on the horizon.
Love it. And what I really like about this is it's super practical, because it's very easy for academics to go and study things that aren't necessarily directly relevant to what people important, but not necessarily directly relevant. What you do is directly relevant, incredibly accessible, and I want to give you huge credit for that, because it's written in a, people often think of academic papers, that sounds a bit dry. Yours is incredibly engaging and easy to read and comes with practical conclusions. So can't wait to see both of those. I will definitely be in line to read them, because I'd love to see what they have to say. I think it's fascinating. So I just want to say thank you for doing what you do, for being at the leading edge of pushing us in a direction I think is really, really, really important, giving people practical steps, but above all, for being a great guest on the show. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Veronica for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about Veronica, her research, to read the paper that we discussed, and some of the other topics that we covered on the show, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it or rating on whichever platform you're listening to the show on, please do so. It really, really does help. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, and there are over 300 of them now, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show. But in the meantime, stay safe. Remember that if you are challenging someone who's imposing rules on you, and they come up with an answer that's something along the lines of because they said so, it might just be worth challenging them. And if you're the person that's implementing rules within an organisation, then get ready for that argument, because I think it's pretty compelling. But above all, stay safe, and I'll see you very soon on another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.